One winter night in 1997, the unthinkable happened. A mountain collapsed and buried a village alive. Trapped under the rubble, freezing and alone, Stuart Diver could hear voices above him, but no one could hear him scream. He was buried alive. Next to him was his wife. One moment, the ski town of Thredbo, New South Wales, was silent. The next, a deafening rumble, screams, and then silence. Rescuers were told it was hopeless. No one could survive what happened, but someone did. This is a story of one of Australia's worst natural disasters. But more importantly, it's a story of how one man was forced to make the most unthinkable choice of his life, just to stay alive. From the time he could walk, Stuart was outdoors, sailing, skiing, hiking, fishing. At first, it wasn't really his idea. His parents were the adventurers. Stuart was just along for the ride. But over time, the mountains grew on him. He wanted to become a ski instructor. Stuart studied hotel management at university, where he met his wife, Sally. They were both outdoorsy and clicked instantly. After several years of dating, they got married and moved to Canada, where they worked at a ski resort for a while. Eventually, they returned to Australia, where Sally took a job as a manager at the Thredbo Alpine Hotel, and Stuart worked as a ski instructor on the mountain. They both moved into one of the staff lodges there for convenience. Then came July 30th, 1997. It was a normal winter night in the mountains. Stuart and Sally had gone about their day, like any other. Work, groceries, dinner. They curled up in bed, unaware that the next few minutes would change everything. Just after 11:30 p.m., something woke them. First came the sound, deep and loud, like a plane flying through the lodge. Then the shaking. The whole lodge rattled violently, but there was no time to react or process what was happening. 4,000 tons of mud, rock, and debris were racing down the mountainside. Within seconds, the entire lodge was overrun by landslide. They were buried alive, trapped beneath tons of debris. Stuart thrashed desperately, but found only solid rubble. There was nowhere to escape. The iron headboard had crushed Sally, trapping her underneath. Then came the water. Freezing cold water from a broken pipe began to flood the space. Stuart tried to cover Sally's mouth. He tried to save her from drowning, but she was pinned. There was nothing he could do. He couldn't save her. All he had left was survival. What Stuart didn't know was that 2 entire lodges had been destroyed, trapping 17 others under the landslide. But above the ground, no one fully understood what had happened. The first calls reported a small explosion. Locals had heard something strange, felt the tremors, but had no idea the mountain had collapsed. Emergency services arrived around 12:30 a.m., with hundreds of rescuers joining in the hours that followed. Medical staff had arrived from local hospitals. Some had even been flown in from hospitals further away. They had no idea how many victims they were looking for. Rescuers dug into the wreckage in brutal, life-threatening conditions. It was minus 12 degrees Celsius, and the ground was so unstable that any wrong move could trigger another slide. Nearly 600 people showed up to help. They used thermal imaging and sound equipment to try pick up signs of life. They used chainsaws and other cutting tools to get through the bigger debris, but everything kept freezing up. Despite the cold and the risks, rescuers kept digging with hand tools for hours and hours. The following morning, the land was declared stable enough to begin extradition of the top layer with some equipment. But once they got through the top layer, they ran into running water, making everything unstable again. Above ground, chaos. Below it, Stuart Diver was clinging to life. He found a tiny pocket of air by arching his back and tilting his head. That small space, maybe the size of a lunchbox, was the only thing keeping him alive. His body was soaked, clothes caked in mud. A rock jabbed into his back. Water surged through the rubble, then drained. And each time it came back, he thought it might be the end. As the hours dragged on, Stuart's mind began to slip. He started hallucinating. He imagined his mother rubbing his feet to keep him warm on the ski lift as a kid. He pictured sunlight, warm beaches, anything but the freezing hell he was now trapped in. He could hear voices above. He'd heard machines and movement above, imagining others had been rescued. But hours passed, then a day, then 2. At the 24-hour mark, only 1 body had been recovered. By the end of day 2, additional bodies had been found, but there were no survivors. But rescuers didn't give up. They knew with every passing minute, the chances of finding survivors were getting smaller. Then, at the 54-hour mark, a breakthrough. On the 3rd day of searching, someone finally heard something. Using the sound equipment, they were listening for any signs of life. They shouted, "Rescue party above, can you hear me?" Stuart heard them. Finally, after being buried for over 2 days, Stuart knew that help was coming for him. He had been trapped 2 meters beneath the surface. He was pinned under 3 huge concrete slabs. To get to him, they had to dig sideways, slowly and carefully. If the slabs shifted even slightly, he'd have been crushed instantly. At many points, rescuers didn't believe they were going to be successful. For the next 11 hours, they worked inch by inch. During that time, they dropped a tiny microphone and speaker into the space to talk to him. A paramedic named Paul Featherson was on the other end. Paul stayed with him the entire time, keeping Stuart focused, awake, alert. Paul knew that Stuart's body was likely close to shutting down and that he needed to keep him talking and his mind present. His temperature was plummeting. He hadn't eaten or had a drink in days. So they piped hot air through a tube, sent him sips of warm fluid, anything to keep him going. When they finally reached him, they carved a hole just big enough to slide in a stretcher and pull him out. After nearly 65 hours buried alive, Stuart was finally pulled from the debris. He had survived, but just barely. Doctors said if they'd arrived just a few hours later, Stuart would have died. His feet suffered frostbite, and he lost 15 kilos in that time. On August 7th, the final body was recovered, and Stuart learned the full truth. His wife, Sally, along with 17 others, had died in the landslide. He was the only survivor. He left hospital a week later, physically healing, but the real battle, grief, was just beginning. Overnight, Stuart had become a household name, but he hadn't asked for that. He'd lost his wife, his friends, everything. And now cameras followed him everywhere. Grief overwhelmed him, and he had no time to process any of it. He started seeing a psychologist. At first, he needed 4-hour sessions, 3 times a week. 2 years later, Stuart co-wrote a memoir called The Survival, the inspirational story of the Thredbo disaster, Sole Survivor. In the years that followed, Stuart slowly began to reclaim pieces of the life that he had lost. He didn't just survive, he chose to live with it. He stayed in Thredbo, choosing to work on the very mountain that had almost taken everything from him. Later, he remarried and became a father. And somehow, he turned his pain into something useful, helping others facing trauma, and using his story to bring hope where there was none. But that night never left him, because how could it? He didn't just lose his wife, he lost his friends, his home, his sense of safety, all in the blink of an eye. And yet, when the world closed in and the darkness took over, Stuart found the smallest crack of air and held on for 65 hours, alone in the freezing cold, with nothing but the sound of dripping water and the weight of the mountain pressing down on him. He shouldn't have made it, but he did. Stuart Diver's story is more than survival, it's about choosing life, even when the world collapses around you, and it's a reminder that sometimes the smallest breath of air is all it takes to hold on. Stuart Diver's story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, hope survives. If this story moved you, subscribe for more survival stories from Australia's history, and tell us, where were you when the Thredbo landslide happened? See you guys next time.